everyone, welcome to This Explainer. Today we're exploring something so completely fundamental to the human experience that, honestly, we often just take it entirely for granted. We are looking at the absolute power of stories. We'll be doing a quick dive into Dr. Susan Edwards' core essay, The Power of Stories, and then we're going to spend most of our time deeply unpacking the Theme 5 essay to examine what actually happens when certain voices are represented, and maybe more importantly, what happens when they aren't. We tend to think of storytelling as just a fun pastime, right? Like a way to entertain kids before bed or kill a couple hours at the movies. But the research we're diving into today frames storytelling entirely differently. It frames it as a biological, neurological, and evolutionary survival tool. Stories aren't just entertainment, they are literally the framework we use to make sense of the universe, our society, and our very own identities.
Okay, let's dive into this first concept. What's more crucial to human evolution, opposable thumbs or stories? It sounds a little like a trick question, doesn't it? Obviously, opposable thumbs let early humans use tools, build shelters, and, physically survive. But according to author Lisa Krohn, whose work is highlighted right there in Dr. Edwards' essay, the answer is not that simple. She argues that story was absolutely crucial to our evolution, maybe even more so than thumbs. As she brilliantly puts it, opposable thumbs let us hang on, but stories told us what to hang on to. Stories provided this crucial shared context that allowed communities to cooperate, pass down critical survival info, and find actual meaning in a totally chaotic world.
And hey, this biological need, it isn't just some relic of the ancient past. It actively impacts our physical health right now. When we completely lose ourselves in a narrative and take on a character's perspective, our brains are actually pumping out dopamine. It enhances our learning, motivation, and empathy. It literally makes us feel less lonely. But perhaps the most mind-blowing piece of data from our source comes from experts at the Yale University School of Public Health. Their studies found that being a bookworm, regularly engaging with written stories, can increase a person's longevity by as much as 23%. 23%! That means getting lost in a good narrative is quite literally a life-extending activity.
Because storytelling is such a massive fundamental human need, the way we craft these narratives has essentially been refined down to a science. Take the animation studio Pixar, for instance. They operate on 6 specific rules to make sure their stories connect with absolutely everyone. A great story has to be universal. It needs a very clear structure and purpose. You gotta have a character to root for, usually an underdog. It has to appeal to our deepest emotions, throw in some surprising and unexpected twists, and ultimately it needs to stay simple and focused. This structural formula is exactly how storytellers manage to get an entire theater full of total strangers to laugh, clap, and jump in their seats at the exact same time.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how our understanding starts to pivot, revealing just how incredibly vulnerable narratives can be. If stories are our main tool for survival and connection, what happens when a story is taken away? Author Francesca Lia Block provides this brilliant, though pretty sobering wordplay. Destroy is, at its root, de-story. Think about that. When a narrative is removed, hidden, or broken down, it doesn't just erase some ink on a page. It literally destroys the framework that people use to exist and understand their place in the world. And that brings us right into Theme 5, which is the core focus of today's explainer: the profound societal impact when specific narratives are left unrepresented.
According to our source material in Theme 5, this whole concept of de-storying happens when people are systematically excluded from the overarching human story. The research actually breaks this exclusion down into 4 distinct structural pillars. We're going to examine exactly what happens when stories are untold, when they are silenced, when they are suppressed, and when they are stolen. Each one of these is a different mechanism that causes society to lose out on the complex, messy, and beautiful reality of the human experience. So let's break down these 4 categories.
We'll start with untold stories. Think back to your high school history classes for a second. We are usually taught about the highly visible, famous figures, right? Like when we learn about the American Civil Rights Movement, we learn the essential stories of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Rosa Parks. Or with the LGBTQIA+ equality movement, it's often represented broadly by the Stonewall riots. But those highly visible narratives, while entirely true and absolutely important, they don't represent the totality of those movements. Countless crucial stories of everyday people, their local grassroots organizing, their individual struggles, their quiet victories, they remain entirely untold. And because of that, our understanding of these massive societal shifts is just incomplete.
Next up, we have silent stories. Now, this is a bit different from a story simply being untold. Silencing involves active, systemic pressure. These are narratives that definitely exist, but they go completely unshared in the public sphere. Why? Usually because of strict societal norms, a severe lack of acceptance, or a very real fear of isolation or even danger. Basically, individuals and sometimes entire communities are essentially forced to push their realities into the shadows just to safely exist within the dominant culture.
The source material actually gives us several diverse historical and sociological examples of this kind of silencing. For instance, in pre-World War II Berlin, there was an institute that explicitly studied gender constructs and human sexuality. But when fascist regimes gained power, they seized the institute and completely destroyed its records, violently silencing that research. Or, for a totally different example, folks outside of Arkansas might be completely unaware that the state has hosted various drag pageants since the 1930s. It's a rich history that has been kept largely quiet. Furthermore, while gender identity often sparks intense debate in the Western world, there are over 30 cultures globally that have historically accepted and even revered variant gender expressions. Yet, those global narratives are frequently silenced in mainstream discussions.
But you know, this macro concept of silencing, it plays out on a very intimate individual level too. To assimilate, fit in, and just be accepted without facing ridicule, people frequently silence their own personal stories. This happens all the time when individuals modify how they present themselves to the public. Someone might change the natural texture of their hair to fit a corporate office standard, or actively hide a regional accent so people don't judge where they're from, or even alter their given name to something that the dominant culture finds easier to pronounce. Why do we do this? It's basically the surrender of selfhood just to conform.
And this brilliantly illustrates the real-world impact of that kind of individual silencing. Let's look at the famous actor Martin Sheen. He was actually born with the surname Estevez, but early in his career, he found he just wasn't getting acting callbacks, so he made the tough decision to change his professional name to Sheen, and boom, his career took off. It's a textbook example of modifying identity for assimilation. But what's really fascinating is that when his two sons became actors, they split the difference. Emilio chose to retain his original identity and kept the name Estevez, while Charlie chose the assimilated path and went with Sheen. Both, as we know, went on to have highly successful careers.
All right, let's move on and see how this builds from individual silencing to widespread systemic action. This is our third category, suppressed stories. While silent stories usually happen because individuals hide themselves out of a sense of fear or self-preservation, suppressed stories are a whole different beast. They require a coordinated institutional effort. This is when systemic power, massive organizations, or governments intentionally hide, bury, or obscure the truth just to protect their own interests or maintain a very specific, curated narrative.
A deeply painful historical example of this suppression, which is highlighted in the text, involves the history of Native American boarding schools. For a huge chunk of history, from the early 1800s all the way up to the 1960s, American Indian children were sent to these facilities, often hundreds of miles away from their families. The explicit intent was to forcefully assimilate them into American culture, and they were routinely punished just for speaking their native languages. The true severity of this was widely suppressed until very recently. In May 2022, the U.S. Interior Department released a 100-page report detailing investigations into these schools, documenting rampant physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. These stories were intentionally kept out of the mainstream historical record for over a century.
But suppression isn't just a dark chapter in the history books, it happens in modern media today. A really contemporary example provided in the source involves the #MeToo movement, which finally brought a lot of suppressed stories into the public eye. Before the movement gained that incredible traction, a media strategy known as catch and kill was super common. Newspapers or media agencies would literally pay for the exclusive rights to stories from women who had been harassed or assaulted. But here's the catch. They didn't buy them to publish them. They bought them strictly to bury them, effectively catching and killing the narrative to protect the public-facing personas of powerful, influential people.
And finally, we reach the fourth and final pillar of unrepresented narratives in Theme 5, stolen stories. This happens when the story, experience, or culture of one person or group is just taken by another and then adopted as their own personal symbol or identity. Stolen stories fundamentally operate from a place of deceit, and they completely strip the original owners of their rightful narrative agency. This usually shows up in two main ways: direct plagiarism and cultural appropriation.
Let's look at exactly how these two forms of theft operate. Plagiarism is just flat-out direct deceit. For example, in 1978, it came to light that author Alex Haley had actually plagiarized significant parts of his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Roots, lifting portions of Kunta Kinte's Chronicle directly from someone else's work. Cultural appropriation, on the flip side, happens all the time across art, fashion, and food. A really clear example is when high-end fashion designers use indigenous tribal headdresses strictly for runway costuming. By doing that, they're taking a visual story while completely ignoring and frankly disrespecting the deep religious and ceremonial significance that the headdress actually holds for the culture it belongs to.
So the crucial point is this. When stories are untold, silenced, suppressed, or stolen, immense damage is done to the very fabric of our society. It fractures us. But the inverse is also true. As author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie powerfully states, stories have been used to dispossess and to malign. But stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. That is so powerful. Healing actually happens when we actively seek out and elevate those narratives that have been missing from the conversation.
And this is exactly why diverse and accurate representation isn't just some corporate buzzword. It is a fundamental human necessity. When we finally bring these lost stories into the light, it allows us to relate and connect with people we might otherwise never understand. It helps us see ourselves reflected in the struggles and the triumphs of others. And ultimately, encountering a really wide, authentic array of stories is what furthers the development of our very own identities. We literally need the full picture of humanity to understand who we truly are.
Which brings us right back to that brilliant wordplay from Francesca Lia Bloch. If destroying is destoring, the tragic act of taking narratives away, then the act of repairing that damage is to restore, or as she puts it, to restory. By actively sharing our own truths and fiercely making space for the untold and suppressed truths of others, we are engaging in the vital, life-saving act of restoring our world. As she says, telling your story is touching. It sets you free.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question to just kind of chew on as you go about your day. Look critically at the media you consume, the history you were taught in school, and even the environment you work in. Ask yourself, what stories are missing here, and how is that absence impacting our society? And maybe even more importantly, I want you to look inward. What parts of your own identity have you silenced just to fit in? What is your authentic story, and how can you begin to share it? Thank you so much for exploring the incredible power of stories with me today. Keep asking those tough questions and always keep seeking out the whole story. Catch you next time.